Sometimes when you create a mock-up, it's very difficult to do it all in Photoshop, simply because either the material you're working with is difficult to render or to get the shadows and highlights correct, or sometimes it's just off at an awkward angle and it's hard to get the perspective, especially if it's something that's three-dimensional and is kind of in a different type of lighting. This is where Adobe Dimensions comes in. This is a great software that allows you to take 3D rendered objects and place your designs on them. In addition to that, you can also play around with different kinds of surfaces. You can do mock-ups of entire packaging and even do some simple little or really complex typographic type designs as well. For this video and the couple of ones ahead, I want to show you some different techniques on how to set up an Adobe Dimensions product. To get started, I'm going to be using this as my example. So this would be an example of a can design that's going to wrap around a metal or an aluminum can. Technically, this is very difficult to do in Photoshop, simply because to put something on a metal can, I would have to wrap it around in 3 dimensions. I wouldn't be able to see all the surfaces, plus I would have to go in and individually or manually add the highlights and shadows. However, let's jump into Adobe Dimensions. If you've never used this before, let me give you a quick introduction to the software. When you launch it, in the middle, of course, you've got your little artboard working area, and this is where we can stage all of our different designs. Now, Adobe Dimensions comes with some basic starter assets, and that's usually what you're going to see over on the far left-hand side. These assets can be different 3D models, and if you scroll down, you can see there's also different textures and different surfaces. There's also different lighting environments that you can place your objects in, as well as different photographs that you can use, both for the background and to place onto your rendered model. If I wanted to place one of these models into my work area, for instance, I'm going to be using one of these beverage cans. Notice that there's 2 of them. I'm going to use this second one that has a smooth area. This other one has some water droplets on there. All you've got to do is to select it, drag it into the area, and then from here I can start to move it around either by clicking on it, or I've got some little handles on the object when it's selected. Each of these handles allows you to do different things. If I was to click on one of the arrows, this will let me move it in that direction. And I've got 3-dimensional space, so I've got 3 different directions that I can move these, up and over. Of course, if I click on the can, it's going to kind of move it in whatever space that I've got selected. If I click on the little square, this is going to allow me to resize and reshape it. Now, of course, if I click on just one square, it's going to move it in that one direction or that one dimension. I can always do Command Z to undo. Or if I hold down Shift, it'll do it in all 3 dimensions. So this is a great way of scaling it up, but keeping everything proportional. Finally, if I click on the little circle, this will allow me to rotate objects in that plane as well. So as I set it up, I can use these as a great way to start off placing my object in this area. But another thing I may want to know is how I can select and move individual things using some of my tools. If you look over to the far left of your screen, you've got a variety of different tools that are mainly geared towards selecting and moving either the camera or objects. If you click and hold on the black arrow, by default you've got your selection tool, but there are different kinds of selections that will let you limit exactly what you want to do. In our case, if I wanted to just move an object, I can select this one, and you can see it's limited now to just the arrows, and I can even now click and move it in bilateral formation too. The same is true if I wanted to just rotate it or scale an object. Those are the other selections. So it comes in handy if you only want to do one manipulation at a time. If I wanted to move my camera around, however, this is where the other set of tools. If I click and hold, the orbit tool is probably the most commonly used one, and you can see there are different ways that you can interact with it. But with this orbit tool, this will allow me to not move the object, but actually move the camera around and get a different angle that I want to work in. I can move left and right, or if I choose the point of rotation, I can move it up and down in orbit all around as well. If I only wanted to move or pan my camera, I can choose the pan tool. This will let me go back and forth or up and down, panning in either direction. And then finally, the other camera move tool is the dolly tool. This lets you move in and out, closer or farther away to your object. So between those two selection tools, it's very important to set up your object and get it placed exactly where you want it to be, and then place your camera where you want it to be as well. Once you've got it done, we can now focus on the right-hand side and look at your different scene and environment properties that you can play with on these panels on the far right. Under the Scene panel, if you have it open, this will allow you to establish your scene, both for the environment, so this would be things like your background. With the environment selected, or even the lighting selected, you can see that it will change up some of the options down below. For instance, I can change up the lighting of my object, making it brighter or darker, or even rotate the position of my lighting to a different place. There's even an overall global lighting that can change up the ground plane, making my shadow more or less transparent. Finally, other things like the reflection and roughness deal with the surface that you're actually working on. Sometimes they're not very evident because right now there's nothing else loaded onto here. If I have my camera selected, I can change things like my field of view. Now this isn't exactly zooming in or out. This is actually changing the perspective of the lens that you're working with. So this is one way you can get more things crowded into a single area. Under Focus, this is where you can set the amount of blur that you want for your object. Finally, under the Scene area, this is where you can change up and manipulate the objects that you have. Notice that this can, whenever I open the little folder, is made up of a pull ring and the can itself. So there's two different objects that I can actually work on if I needed to manipulate it. With the pull ring selected, if I wanted to zoom in just on that area, here's a good trick to know. At the very top, you've got a set of cameras, and this will allow you to frame up exactly what you have selected. So if I wanted to zoom in just on that pull can, or the pull top, this will bring it up and make it a little bit easier for me to manipulate it. From here, I can just orbit around and get a different side if I wanted to see it. With the Pull tab selected, I can do things like scale it up and rotate it. So if I wanted to make it look like this was open, I can just select the appropriate hinge and I can open it up this way. Now if I wanted to affect just the can itself, I can select the can layer. Notice now that it's selected. And right now this can doesn't look very metallic. It's just got a basic default matte finish. If I go over to my starter assets and scroll down underneath my models, I can find a set of standard materials that I can apply to it. To apply something like the metal material, I can click and drag and drop it on top of the can, and now you can see it has that metallic type sheen and finish to it. Additionally, I can change up some of the properties to it. I can even change the opacity and make it a semi-transparent metal can, or make it a rougher style of metal, or make it less metallic and have more of a buffed kind of sheen to it. What I'd really like to do is let's zoom back out and add one of my graphics to the side of the can. Now there are some predefined graphics over here, but what we want to do is we want to add a graphic to this area. So with the can still selected, under the actions, I can place a graphic on my model by clicking here. This is where I can go into my designs that I've already saved. So here's my Koosh Soda JPEG. When I click open, we'll give it a second, and you can see it loads onto the can. Now it's going to do the best it can to make it placed on here, and obviously it's on the wrong side and rotated around. So to be able to select it, I'm going to choose my black arrow, and I can scale it up by clicking on the edges and holding the Shift key, and I can rotate it by clicking on the little top area and moving it down this way. From here, all I've got to do is to scale it and rotate it around and get it to fit as best as I can. Keep in mind, this is just a mock-up that we're working with, so it doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but we do want it to look nice and as believable as possible. So I'll scale this up, maybe rotate it around, and get the edges. I'm specifically looking at these little edges that are up here. until finally it fills in really nicely and looks good right where it's at. That looks good. With this done, I can also add other predefined models and play around with their effects too. If I go into my models area, there's one model for a splash. There's actually a couple of different styles of splash. I'm going to get splash B. Let's drag it on. And I want to be able to put it right here on top. So you can see as I click and drag around, it's going to try to align it to a surface. In my case, I want to align it to this top surface right here. And awesome that it's here, but it's a little bit too big. So again, let's go up to our camera and let's zoom out so I can see it and frame up everything. And let's see if we can rotate it and actually place it where it needs to be. So we'll go down here, maybe scale it down just a bit. Use the red arrow to drag it up, blue arrow to drag it over. There we go. Now we're moving it into place. Again, maybe I need to rotate my camera just a bit more. And choose your selection tool. I'm going to get it actually splashing, whoops, too far. Splashing just out of that area. Now with it coming out, we want it to look kind of like a berry cola. So I'm going to scroll down and see if we can find a thing that'll work well. There is a beer one, so I'm going to click and drag it onto my object. And to change the color of it, I've got my object selected. We can choose the properties for the splash. So if I open up the properties by clicking on the icon, here's where I can change my base color. Then from here, let's choose a splash color that's a little bit more appropriate for what we're working with. If I need to, I can still change up the amount of glow, maybe make it more or less metallic, or change the opacity of it to make it a little bit lighter. Now let's set up our scene and think about a background that I can place this in. From here, I can go up to my environment, choose my environment. And if I want to change it to just a simple color background color, I can choose under my properties a background and click on the color. And let's change it to something like a bright blue. Now that we've got everything set up, we need to set up our final frame and have it fully rendered. So again, I'm going to go to my tools for my camera. We'll get it set so I can see the front of it. Maybe rotate around just a bit. That looks good. Cool, I like seeing the little ground plane. And I'm going to back out so I can see it a little bit more. Once you've got your object and its mock-up nice and framed out, we need to render it. As we've been working in this software, in order for it to quickly render, it's been doing everything kind of at a lower quality. The final render needs to be a nice high quality type image. If you look up at the very top left-hand corner, we've been working in design mode. When you choose render mode, this will give it just a moment to load up all of your objects. And while it's doing that, let's have a look over here on the right-hand side. First, you can give it a name, and you can tell where you want it to be exported to. I'm going to save it locally on my computer. We'll call this layer Soda Render. And there's different qualities that these can render into. The fastest way will give you a lower quality image, but to be honest, it'll be a pretty good one to work with to show a mock-up. Higher quality images, larger resolutions, will take several minutes to do. So for the sake of time, I'm going to choose low quality. You can also export this as a PSD or as a PNG file. For now, I'm going to choose PNG. I'm saving mine to a desktop, and I'm going to click Render. Again, it'll take just a few moments to render all of the light particles and the surface renderings together, but once it's finished, it'll give you a warning or let you know that it's been saved to our desktop, and we'll have a look at it. All right, and so now that it's finished, again, you had a little counter down here at the bottom. On my desktop, now I've got a great little rendering with the object placed onto it. And again, it's a bit of a lower quality rendering, but it's a good starting point for what I have. If I chose a higher quality, it will give me a higher resolution, but this is a good starting for what I need. I can then go back to my Design tab, and I can move things around and place it exactly where I need to if I need to change up the placement of this object. All of these Adobe Dimensions files can be saved and used later. So let's go up to File and Save. I'm going to call this my Soda Mockup. and make sure to save this in a folder where you can find it later. The size of these files, just out of curiosity, will look like this. There it is there. It's a DN file, and if I open it up, are going to be relatively large, so several megabytes just to render this particular thing. But it gives you full flexibility over placing it exactly where you want, and so these are actually a little bit smaller than some Photoshop mock-ups could be.